The operating lights burned white above Thomas Miller's unconscious body. His face had swollen to twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and discolored, unrecognizable even to those who loved him. Machines beeped irregular warnings as Dr. Patricia Hayes gripped her scalpel. 1 week earlier, Thomas had stood before his bathroom mirror, razor in hand, touching the small bump beneath his beard. Just an ingrown hair, he thought, nothing worth worrying about. His wife Sarah had called from the kitchen that morning, her voice carrying concern he'd chosen to ignore. "You should see a doctor, honey." Thomas had laughed it off, the way men of his generation always did. Now Sarah sat alone in the surgical waiting room, mascara streaking her cheeks. The wall clock read 2:47 in the morning. Their daughter Emily was somewhere over Kansas, racing home on the first available flight. Thomas had maybe hours left. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Thomas Miller had lived in the same house in Pittsburgh's Lawrenceville neighborhood for 25 years. Every morning began the same way, 6 o'clock alarm, black coffee, 2 slices of wheat toast, and the ritual of shaving before his father's old mirror. That Monday morning, when his razor caught on the small bump beneath his beard, Thomas barely registered it at 52. After 3 decades as a carpenter, he'd survived worse than a minor skin irritation, a splinter through the palm, a nail gun misfire, countless cuts and bruises that came with the trade. This was nothing. Sarah stood at the kitchen counter preparing his lunch the way she had for 30 years of marriage. She'd been a nurse once, back before Emily was born, back when they were young and full of plans. Now she filled her days with crossword puzzles and worry, watching her husband pretend he was invincible. "That spot on your face looks red," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. Thomas touched his cheek absently. "Just a pimple." She wanted to say more. 3 decades of marriage had taught her when to push and when to let silence do the work. Words couldn't. But lately, silence seemed to be all they had. The empty chair at their breakfast table spoke louder than either of them ever could. Their daughter Emily hadn't been home in 5 years. Her high school photo still sat on the mantel, frozen at 17, smiling and hopeful. The woman she'd become, 28 now and living in Seattle, remained a stranger to them both. Birthday cards went unanswered. Christmas calls lasted 3 awkward minutes. Thomas told himself it was natural. Kids grew up, moved away, built their own lives. He'd done the same to his own father, hadn't he? But Sarah kept Emily's room exactly as she'd left it. And sometimes Thomas caught his wife standing in the doorway, staring at the empty bed like it might offer answers. At the workshop, Thomas ran Miller Carpentry with 3 employees who'd been with him for years. Jake, Marcus, and Dennis knew better than to ask their boss about doctor visits or health concerns. Men didn't talk about such things, not in their world. You showed up, did the work, went home. Complaints were for the weak. When Jake noticed the redness spreading across Thomas's jaw that afternoon, he made a joke about testosterone and acne. The other men laughed. Thomas laughed too, even though touching the spot sent a sharp pain through his cheek. That evening, Sarah left a bottle of antibiotic ointment on the bathroom counter. Thomas saw it, considered using it, then brushed his teeth and went to bed instead. The bump could wait. Everything could wait. That's what he'd always believed, what his father had taught him, what he'd lived by his entire life. Some lessons, he would soon learn, were meant to be unlearned. By Wednesday morning, the bump had doubled in size. Thomas stood before the bathroom mirror, prodding the angry red swelling with his fingertip. Pain shot through his jaw, sharp enough to make him wince. He told himself it was just a cyst, the kind that needed to come to a head before it could heal. His father had gotten them sometimes, back when Thomas was a boy watching him work in the old shop. At the pharmacy, Thomas bought the strongest acne cream they sold over the counter. The teenager at the register didn't look up from her phone as she bagged his purchase. He applied it that night, thick and white against his reddened skin, and tried to ignore how hot the area felt beneath his fingers. Sarah had left a bottle of leftover antibiotics on the bathroom counter. He'd seen them that morning, considered taking one, then decided against it. Antibiotics were for real infections, not glorified pimples. Besides, they were probably expired. At the workshop, Thomas was nailing trim boards for a custom bookshelf when his hammer slipped. The impact sent vibrations through his hand, up his arm, and somehow the pain registered in his swollen cheek. He froze, hammer raised, waiting for the throbbing to subside. Marcus looked up from the table saw. "Boss, your face is looking pretty swollen there." Thomas touched his jaw self-consciously. "It's nothing, just a little irritation. You sure my cousin had something like that once? Turned out to be infected to us?" I said, "It's nothing." The conversation ended there, the way conversations among men often did. They returned to their work, the whine of power tools filling the silence. Thursday morning brought a new level of concern. The swelling had spread across Thomas's right cheek, pulling the skin tight and shiny. When he pressed on it, the pain made his eyes water. He could barely open his mouth wide enough to brush his teeth. Sarah was waiting when he came downstairs. She'd set out breakfast, but her plate remained untouched, her coffee cooling in its mug. "We're going to the doctor today," she said. Not a question, a statement. Thomas poured himself coffee, his hand steadier than he felt. "It's just swollen. It'll go down." "Thomas, please." Her voice cracked on his name. "I've been watching this for 3 days now. It's getting worse, not better." "We can't afford an emergency visit for a skin problem, Sarah. You know that." The words hung between them, heavy, with implications. Last year's medical bills still haunted them. Sarah's emergency gallbladder surgery had maxed out their credit cards, left them owing $23,000 at interest rates that made Thomas sick to think about. Their insurance had covered some of it, but not enough. Never enough. "I don't care about the money," Sarah said, and Thomas heard something break in her voice. When he looked up, she was crying, silent tears running down her cheeks. In 30 years of marriage, he'd seen her cry exactly 4 times. Their wedding day, when Emily was born, at her mother's funeral, and the day their daughter stopped answering their calls. This made 5. "Sarah, don't." "Your father's—" she started, then stopped. They never talked about his father. The cancer that had started as a small mole on his neck, the way he'd ignored it until it was too late, until the doctors could only make him comfortable while he wasted away. Thomas grabbed his work jacket. "I have to go. We have a deadline." He left her standing in the kitchen, and the shame of it followed him all the way to the shop by Friday. Thomas was running a fever. The thermometer read 99.5, barely above normal. But his body felt heavy and wrong. He swallowed 3 Tylenol with his morning coffee and headed to work anyway. The swelling had become impossible to hide. A client came by to check on the progress of a dining table, took one look at Thomas, and asked if he was okay. "Bee sting," Thomas lied. "I'm allergic." The client nodded, but his expression suggested he didn't quite believe it. That evening, Thomas couldn't eat the dinner Sarah had prepared. His jaw hurt too much to chew, and the fever had killed his appetite anyway. He sat at the table, pushing pot roast around his plate, while Sarah watched him with frightened eyes. After he went to bed, she stayed up late at her laptop, typing symptoms into search engines. The results terrified her. Cellulitis, abscess, necrotizing fasciitis, each condition more serious than the last, each requiring immediate medical attention. She printed out an article about skin infections and left it on the kitchen table where Thomas would see it in the morning. She knew he wouldn't read it. She left it anyway. Thomas found the article at breakfast. He scanned the first few paragraphs, his jaw clenching with each word. Then he crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. Saturday brought a new crisis. The swelling had crossed over to his left cheek now, and his temperature had spiked to 101 degrees. Thomas spent the day in bed, drifting in and out of feverish sleep, while Sarah sat in the chair beside him. At 3 in the morning, she couldn't take it anymore. She picked up her phone, fingers hovering over the emergency number. Her hand shook as she prepared to dial. The light from the screen woke Thomas. He saw what she was doing and grabbed the phone from her hand. "No," he said, his voice hoarse and thick. "We can't afford it." "I don't care about the money." "Well, I do." He handed back her phone. "We're still paying off your surgery, Sarah. We're barely making the minimums as it is. Do you know what another emergency room visit would cost? Do you have any disinterest?" She did know. $23,000 in debt had taught her exactly what medical care cost in America. It had taught her that sometimes you had to choose between health and financial survival. "You could die," she whispered. "I'm not going to die from a swollen face." But even as he said it, Thomas felt the fever burning through him, felt the tight, hot pain spreading across his jaw. For the first time, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was wrong. He ignored it. He'd been ignoring warning signs his whole life. Why stop now? Sunday morning, Thomas woke to a face he didn't recognize in the mirror. His reflection showed a stranger, features swollen and distorted beyond human proportion. His right eye had disappeared entirely beneath puffy, discolored flesh. The left was barely a slit. His jaw had expanded to twice its normal width. The skin stretched so tight it looked ready to split. When he tried to touch it, his hand trembled. For the first time in his adult life, Thomas Miller felt genuine fear. Sarah found him standing in the bathroom, staring at himself. She'd been awake all night, watching him sleep, counting his breaths, checking his pulse. The dark circles under her eyes told their own story. "We're calling an ambulance," she said. "Not a request. We can't afford it. Thomas, look at yourself. Please, just look." He was looking. He couldn't stop looking. The monster in the mirror wore his father's old flannel shirt, but nothing else about the reflection seemed familiar. This couldn't be him. This couldn't be real. "If we call an ambulance, they'll take me to the emergency room," Thomas said, his words slurred by the swelling. "Do you know what that costs? Just the ambulance ride alone is $2,000. Then the ER fees, the tests, everything else. We'll lose the house. Sarah, I already mortgaged the house." The words hit him like a physical blow. He turned to face her, moving too quickly. Pain shot through his skull. "You what?" "Wednesday," Sarah said quietly. "After you refused to go to the doctor, I went to the bank and took out a home equity loan for $180,000. Thomas gripped the sink. The bathroom tilted around him. "You had no right." "I had every right. I'm on the deed, too. Remember, we bought this house together. We built it together. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let you die in it because you're too proud to admit you're sick. This house is everything we have." "No," Sarah said, and her voice broke. "You are everything I have. You're all I've got left." The truth of it hung between them. Emily was gone. Had been gone for 5 years. Their daughter was a voice on the phone twice a year, a Christmas card with no return address, a wound that never quite healed. If Thomas died, Sarah would have nothing, no one. "The money doesn't matter," she continued. "None of it matters. Please, Thomas, please let me call." But Thomas was already falling. His legs gave out, and he collapsed against the bathroom wall, sliding down to sit on the cold tile floor. The fever had spiked to 103 degrees. His skin felt like it was burning from the inside out. Sarah knelt beside him, pulling her phone from her pocket. This time, Thomas didn't stop her. While they waited for the ambulance, sitting together on the bathroom floor, Thomas's mind drifted backward through time. He was 32 again, working in the old shop with his crew. They were building custom cabinets for a restaurant downtown, racing against a deadline. Thomas had been running a piece of oak through the table saw when it kicked back. The board flew up, a splinter breaking off and embedding itself in his right cheek, just below the bone. Blood ran down his face, dripped onto his work shirt. The other men wanted to take him to the hospital, but Thomas had refused. Sarah had just given birth to Emily 3 months earlier. They were drowning in medical bills from the delivery, barely keeping their heads above water. Thomas couldn't afford to miss work, couldn't afford an emergency room visit for what amounted to a glorified splinter. He'd gone into the bathroom, locked the door, and tried to pull it out himself with tweezers. The pain had been excruciating. After 20 minutes of trying, blood running down his neck, he'd given up. The wound had bled for hours, finally clotting around the embedded wood. When he got home that night, Sarah had been feeding Emily in the nursery. Thomas had washed the blood away, told her he'd scraped his face on a cabinet door. She'd believed him because she trusted him, because in 30 years he'd never given her reason not to. The wound had healed over, leaving a small scar he'd hidden with his beard. He'd forgotten about it, pushed it from his mind the way he pushed everything uncomfortable from his mind. Now, sitting on the bathroom floor 20 years later, Thomas understood. The splinter had never come out. It had been festering beneath his skin for 2 decades, a time bomb waiting to explode. And when that small bump appeared last Monday, when he'd dismissed it as nothing, he'd sealed his fate. His stubbornness hadn't just delayed treatment. It had created the problem in the first place. The realization made him want to weep. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Sarah stood and went to unlock the front door. Thomas tried to stand too, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He remained on the floor, a 52-year-old man who'd built his entire life around being strong, reduced to helpless weakness by his own pride. The paramedics came up the stairs in a rush of professional efficiency. They took one look at Thomas, and their expressions changed. He saw it, that flash of concern that medical professionals try to hide. "How long has he been like this?" one of them asked Sarah. The swelling started. "Monday. It's gotten worse every day. He's running a fever of 103, and you're just calling us now." The judgment in the question cut Sarah to the core, but she stood tall. "He didn't want to come. I finally convinced him this morning." They loaded Thomas onto a stretcher, carried him down the stairs he'd built with his own hands, through the living room he'd furnished with pieces from his shop, out the front door into the cold morning air. Neighbors stood on their porches, watching. Thomas closed his one good eye, unable to bear their stares. In the ambulance, Sarah held his pulse, while the paramedic started in an IV. Thomas tried to speak, but his jaw barely moved. "Save your strength," the paramedic said. His voice was gentle but urgent. "We're going to take care of you." Through the fog of fever, Thomas heard the paramedic radio ahead to the hospital. The words came through in fragments: possible sepsis, necrotizing fasciitis, patient waited over a week, vitals unstable. Sarah's grip on his hand tightened. Thomas thought about Emily, wondered if she'd even care that he was dying, wondered if she'd come home for his funeral, or if her absence would become permanent, a ghost haunting the empty rooms of their lives. His last conscious thought, before the fever dragged him under, was simple and devastating. "I should have listened." The emergency room at UPMC Presbyterian had been alerted. 6 medical staff stood ready when the ambulance doors burst open. Thomas was rushed through the corridors that blurred into white walls and fluorescent lights, Sarah running behind, her hand still reaching for his even as they pulled him away. In the trauma bay, hands moved over him with practiced urgency. IVs were placed, blood drawn, monitors attached. The beeping of machines created a symphony of medical crisis. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of urgent conversations. Blood pressure dropping, temperature 104.2, get me a CBG, comprehensive metabolic panel, and blood cultures stat. A woman's face appeared above him, her features swimming in and out of focus. She wore surgical scrubs and had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Something about her seemed familiar. "Thomas," she said clearly, "I'm Dr. Patricia Hayes. I'm going to take care of you. Can you hear me?" He managed a slight nod. "We're going to run some tests and figure out what's happening. You're in the right place now." Patricia Hayes. The name echoed through Thomas's fever-addled brain, stirring memories from decades past. He tried to place her, but consciousness slipped away again. The CT scan revealed what physical examination had suggested. Deep within Thomas's right cheek, embedded in tissue that had long ago scarred over it, was a foreign object. The images showed it clearly, a sliver of dense material that had been there for years, perhaps decades. Around it, the infection had spread like wildfire through the fascial planes of his face. Dr. Hayes studied the scans with growing concern. She'd seen necrotizing fasciitis before, had operated on cases that came in too late. The mortality rate was devastating when treatment was delayed. This man had waited over a week. She pulled up his chart, read his name again, Thomas Miller. The age matched. She did the math in her head, felt a strange lurch in her chest. Could it really be him? "Do we have any history on the patient?" she asked the resident beside her. "Nothing remarkable, some occupational injuries over the years. Last hospital visit was 15 years ago." Dr. Hayes looked at Thomas through the glass of the CT suite. Even with his face grotesquely swollen, she could see traces of the boy she'd known in high school, Thomas Miller, star of the baseball team, Thomas Miller, who'd made her sophomore year a living hell. She remembered the taunts in the hallway, the cruel nicknames, the way he and his friends had laughed when she'd fallen down the stairs. She'd been so certain he'd tripped her on purpose, though she could never prove it. That fall had broken her glasses and bruised her ribs, but worse than the physical pain was the humiliation. Patricia Hayes had left that school as soon as she could, graduated early, thrown herself into her studies with the fury of someone determined to prove her worth. She'd become a surgeon partly to help people, but also partly to show everyone who'd ever underestimated her that they had been wrong. And now, Thomas Miller lay dying in her emergency room. The irony wasn't lost on her. A memory surfaced, one she'd almost forgotten. The same day as the stairs incident, her younger brother Danny had nearly drowned at the lake. She hadn't been there, had been home nursing her injuries. Her parents told her later that someone had pulled Danny out, performed CPR, saved his life. They never learned who. The rescuer had disappeared before anyone could thank him. Danny was a pediatrician now, saving children's lives the way someone had once saved his. Dr. Hayes made her decision in an instant. The past was the past. Right now, she had a patient who needed her skills, and she was the best surgeon in this hospital for this particular nightmare. She walked into the trauma bay where Sarah sat beside Thomas's bed. The older woman looked up with desperate hope in her eyes. "Mrs. Miller, I'm Dr. Hayes. I need to explain your husband's condition." What followed was the hardest conversation Sarah had ever endured. Dr. Hayes laid out the facts with compassionate clarity. Thomas had necrotizing fasciitis, commonly called flesh-eating bacteria. The infection had already spread to the deeper tissues of his face and was causing sepsis. Without immediate surgical intervention, it would reach his brain within 12 hours. "The surgery will be extensive," Dr. Hayes continued. "We'll need to remove all infected tissue, in your husband's case. That could mean removing up to 40% of the muscle and fascia in his right cheek. There's a risk to his eye, to his facial nerve, and even with surgery, his survival rate is approximately 60%. Sarah's hands shook as she signed the consent forms. The papers blurred through her tears. Then came the financial coordinator, a thin woman with a clipboard and apologetic eyes. "Mrs. Miller, I need to discuss payment. Your husband's insurance company has indicated they won't be covering this procedure." "What? Why?" "They're claiming patient negligence. Because your husband delayed seeking treatment, they consider this a preventable complication." The words hit Sarah like a physical assault. $450,000. The number appeared on the estimate sheet, impossibly large. Even with the home equity loan, they couldn't cover it. They'd lose everything. Sarah felt herself crumpling, her legs giving way. A nurse caught her, guided her to a chair. Thomas's eyes opened. Just barely. His voice came out as a whisper, barely audible over the machines. "Sarah, don't worry about the money. Just call Emily." Then he was gone again, pulled under by fever and medication. Sarah found herself in a quiet corridor, phone in her trembling hand. She scrolled to Emily's number, a number she'd called so many times over 5 years, leaving messages that went unreturned. The phone rang and rang. Voicemail. "Emily, it's Mom." Sarah's voice cracked. "Your father, honey, your father is dying. Please, you need to come home. I know things have been difficult, but he needs you. I need you. Please call me back." She hung up and waited. 2 hours passed in agony. Sarah sat in the waiting room, watching the clock, watching her phone, watching the doors that led to the surgical wing where they were preparing to operate on her husband. When her phone finally rang, she nearly dropped it. "Mom!" Emily's voice was cold, controlled. "Are you serious? Is this some kind of manipulation? Emily, please, your father is in the hospital. He has a severe infection. They're saying he might not survive." Silence stretched across the miles between Pittsburgh and Seattle. "He didn't come to my wedding," Emily said finally. 5 years ago, Mom, my wedding day, and he couldn't be bothered to show up. You don't understand. There's something you don't know about that day. I don't want to hear excuses. Emily, please, whatever anger you're holding, you can be angry at him when he's ill, but right now, I'm begging you, come home. Say goodbye if that's all you can manage, but don't let it end like this." Another long silence. Then Emily spoke, her voice barely audible. "I'll see what flights are available." The line went dead. Sarah sat with her phone pressed against her chest, not sure if her daughter would actually come, knowing only that she'd tried. That's all any mother could do. 10 minutes later, a text came through. "Flight leaves in 3 hours, landing at 5 a.m. Sarah closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. 2 o'clock in the morning, Sarah sat alone in the surgical waiting room, watching the wall clock's second hand make its endless circle. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound marked another moment her husband fought for his life, behind doors she couldn't enter. The room was empty except for her. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly pale glow. A television in the corner played the news on mute, images of distant tragedies flickering across the screen. Sarah couldn't look at it. Her own tragedy was happening right here. She opened her wallet, pulled out the photo she kept tucked behind her driver's license. The 3 of them at the beach. Emily, maybe 7 years old, gap-toothed and grinning. Thomas had his arm around Sarah's waist, pulling her close. They looked happy. They had been happy once upon a time, before silence became their primary language, before Emily stopped coming home, before Thomas's pride became more important than his health. Sarah traced her finger over Emily's face in the photograph. When had things gone so wrong? The wedding, 5 years ago. That's when the final thread had snapped. Emily had called from Vancouver, her voice bright with excitement. She'd met someone, fallen in love, was getting married in 3 months. Would they come? Of course they'd come. Sarah had started planning immediately, buying a new dress, booking the hotel, then 2 days before the flight, Thomas had called from a hospital in Ohio, a car accident on a business trip. He'd said minor injuries. But he couldn't travel. Sarah should go without him. But Sarah couldn't leave him. She'd canceled her flight, stayed by the phone, waiting for updates that never seemed serious enough to warrant missing their daughter's wedding. Thomas had been discharged the next day, came home with barely a bruise visible. Emily had been devastated, furious. She'd screamed at them over the phone, called them selfish, said she never wanted to see them again. And for 5 years, she'd kept that promise. Sarah had never understood why Thomas hadn't tried harder to make it, why he'd given up so easily. They'd fought about it exactly once. A vicious argument that ended with Thomas walking out of the house for 3 hours. When he came back, the subject was closed. They never spoke of it again. Now, sitting in this waiting room, Sarah pulled out another paper from her purse, the home equity loan documents, signed and notarized. $180,000 borrowed against the house Thomas had built with his own hands. Every beam, every board, every nail a testament to his skill and dedication. She'd signed away their security without telling him, and she'd do it again. She'd sign away everything if it meant he'd live behind the surgical doors. Dr. Patricia Hayes made the first incision. The smell hid immediately. Necrotic tissue has a distinctive odor, sweet and putrid at the same time. The surgical team had encountered it before, but it never got easier. One of the younger nurses turned away briefly before composing herself. Patricia worked with focused precision, opening the swollen tissue layer by layer. The infection had spread far deeper than the T-scan suggested. She could see the path of destruction the bacteria had carved through Thomas's face, following the fascial planes like highways. In the first hour, they removed the obviously dead tissue. Gray, lifeless muscle came away in pieces. Patricia worked methodically, cutting away everything that couldn't be saved, preserving what she could. The second hour brought a worse discovery. The infection had reached the mandible, the jawbone itself showing signs of compromise. Patricia paused, considering her options. If the bone was infected, they'd need to remove sections of it. Thomas would need reconstruction, multiple surgeries. His face would never be the same. She made the call to preserve the bone, to treat it with aggressive antibiotic irrigation and hope for the best. It was a calculated risk. In the third hour, disaster struck. The monitors started screaming. Thomas's heart had stopped. Starting compressions. The anesthesiologist called out. He began chest compressions while Patricia stepped back from the surgical field, her gloved hands raised and dripping. 47 seconds. That's how long Thomas Miller was technically dead. 47 seconds while his heart refused to beat, while the machines fought to bring him back. Then the rhythm returned, steady and strong. Patricia released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The fourth hour was spent carefully reconstructing what could be saved. 30% of the muscle in his right cheek was gone, removed to save his life. Patricia worked to preserve the facial nerve, to maintain some function, some dignity. In the fifth hour, the pathology results came back from the tissue samples. Patricia read the report twice, hoping she'd misunderstood, but the words were clear: basal cell carcinoma, invasive subtype, not just an infection, cancer. She looked down at Thomas's unconscious form. This man couldn't catch a break. The sixth hour required a difficult decision. With cancer present, Patricia needed to remove more tissue to get clean margins. It meant more disfigurement, more loss, but it might save his life in the long run. She made the cuts. At one point, exhausted and emotionally drained, Patricia stepped back. A nurse offered her water. She drank it mechanically, her mind elsewhere. She was remembering a summer day 35 years ago. She'd been 12, her brother Danny 10. They'd gone to the lake with friends. Patricia had been reading on the shore when someone screamed. Danny had swum out too far, got caught in the current, gone under. Patricia couldn't swim well enough to save him. She'd stood on the shore, screaming for help, watching her baby brother drown. Then someone was in the water, swimming with powerful strokes. A teenage boy, maybe 17. He'd reached Danny, pulled him to shore, performed CPR. By the time their parents arrived, Danny was breathing again and the boy was gone. They'd never learned his name. Patricia had tried to find him for years, wanting to say thank you, wanting to tell him that Danny had lived, had thrived. But the boy had vanished like a ghost, the haze. The nurse's voice pulled her back. "Are you okay?" Patricia looked down at Thomas Miller, at the scar on his right shoulder, visible above the surgical drape, a scar shaped like a cross, the kind lifeguards wore in the summer sun. "I owe him this," she said quietly. "Let's finish." A nurse brought Sarah a bag of Thomas's personal effects: wallet, keys, wedding ring, phone. Sarah held the ring, warm from being against his skin, and cried. Inside the wallet, she found something unexpected. An envelope, old and creased, tucked behind Thomas's insurance card. The handwriting on the outside was his: "For Emily, if something happens to me." Sarah's hands shook as she opened it. The letter inside was dated 5 years ago, written the week of Emily's wedding. Thomas's handwriting covered 3 pages. He explained everything. The business trip to Ohio that wasn't really a business trip. He'd been driving to Vancouver, wanted to surprise Emily, to walk her down the aisle. But somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, a deer had run into the road. Thomas had swerved, hit a tree. The impact had broken 3 ribs and given him a concussion. He'd spent 3 days in a small hospital, alone, in pain. He'd begged them to release him, to let him get to his daughter's wedding, but the doctors refused. With broken ribs and a head injury, he couldn't fly or drive. He'd called his best friend Robert, sworn him to secrecy, made Robert promise never to tell Emily or Sarah the truth. Thomas didn't want to ruin Emily's wedding day with worry, didn't want her starting her marriage with guilt over his accident. Robert had kept that secret until his death from cancer 2 years later. The letter ended simply, "Emily, I would have moved heaven and earth to be there. Please know that I love you more than anything in this world, Dad." Sarah sobbed. Great, heaving cries that shook her entire body. 5 years of misunderstanding. 5 years of pain that could have been avoided with one honest conversation. The waiting room doors burst open. Emily ran in, her hair disheveled, eyes big and swollen from crying during the entire flight. She'd aged in 5 years, no longer the bright-eyed 23-year-old who'd left Pittsburgh. She looked tired, worn down by anger she'd been carrying too long. "Mom?" Emily's voice cracked. "How's he?" Sarah couldn't speak. She just held out the letter. Emily took it with trembling hands, began to read. Sarah watched her daughter's face crumple as the truth revealed itself, all the anger, all the justified rage Emily had nursed for 5 years, dissolving in the face of her father's love. "He was coming," Emily whispered. "He was coming to my wedding. He didn't want you to worry. He thought he was protecting you." Emily collapsed into the chair beside her mother, the letter clutched to her chest. 5 years. I wasted 5 years being angry at him for something that wasn't his fault. Sarah pulled her daughter close, held her the way she used to when Emily was small and the world seemed scary. They sat together, two women who'd lost so much time, crying for what might have been. And at 6:30 in the morning, the surgical doors opened. Dr. Hayes emerged, still in her blood-stained scrubs, a surgical mask pulled down around her neck. She looked exhausted, older than her years, but there was something like relief in her eyes. Sarah and Emily stood, gripping each other's hands. "He made it," Dr. Hayes said. But the word "but" hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Dr. Hayes gestured for them to sit. Sarah's legs gave out, and Emily caught her, guided her back to the chair. They sat together, bracing for whatever came next. "Your husband is alive," Dr. Hayes began, choosing her words carefully. "We were able to remove the infected tissue and stop the spread of the necrotizing fasciitis. However, the damage was extensive. We had to remove approximately 30% of the muscle and fascia in his right cheek. The scarring will be significant and permanent." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "During surgery, we also discovered something else." Dr. Hayes pulled out a tablet, showed them images they couldn't fully comprehend. The tissue samples revealed basal cell carcinoma, an invasive form of skin cancer. "We removed all the cancerous tissue we could identify, but your husband will need radiation therapy and possibly chemotherapy as follow-up treatment." Emily's hand went to her mouth. "Cancer. How is that possible?" "We found a foreign object embedded deep in the tissue, a piece of wood that had been there for years, possibly decades. The chronic irritation and infection around it likely contributed to the cellular changes that led to cancer." Sarah remembered the scar Thomas had hidden with his beard, the one he'd dismissed as nothing. How long had he been carrying this time bomb in his face? "Can we see him?" Sarah asked. "He's in the ICU, still sedated. You can see him briefly, but I need to prepare you. His face will be heavily bandaged. There are breathing tubes, drainage tubes, monitoring equipment. It will be difficult to see him this way." They followed Dr. Hayes through the sterile corridors to the intensive care unit. Nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. Thomas lay motionless on the bed, his head wrapped in layers of white gauze. Only his left eye was visible, swollen shut. Tubes emerged from his nose and mouth. More tubes drained fluid from beneath the bandages, collecting in bags marked with measurements and tool. Machines beeped steadily, monitoring every function of his struggling body. Sarah approached the bed, took his hand. It felt cold despite the warm room. "I'm here. Honey, Emily's here too. We're both here." No response, just the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator breathing for him. Emily stood back, one hand covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. This broken man in the hospital bed bore no resemblance to the father she remembered. Strong, stubborn Thomas Miller, reduced to tubes and bandages and beeping machines. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." On the third day, a woman from the hospital's financial services department came to speak with Sarah. She wore a sympathetic expression that didn't quite reach her eyes, the look of someone who delivered bad news for a living. The itemized bill ran to 17 pages. Sarah stared at the total $487,342. Emergency room services, $45,000. Surgical fees, $285,000. ICU care, $15,000 per day. Medications, imaging, pathology, consultations. The numbers blurred together into an incomprehensible mountain of debt. "Now, your husband's insurance through Lifeguard will cover a portion of this," the woman said, pulling up information on her computer. Sarah felt a flutter of hope. Then the woman's expression changed. "Oh, I see. I'm very sorry, Mrs. Miller, but the insurance company has denied the claim." The room tilted. Sarah gripped the edge of the desk. "Denied on what grounds?" "They're citing patient negligence. According to their policy, when a patient delays seeking treatment for a clearly worsening condition, resulting complications are not covered." "That's insane. My husband didn't know how serious it was." "I understand your frustration, but the documentation shows your husband waited over a week with progressively worsening symptoms before seeking medical attention. Lifeguard considers this preventable." Sarah thought of Emily, working for Lifeguard Insurance in Seattle. The irony was devastating. Emily, who'd been sitting silently beside her mother, suddenly stood. Her face had gone pale, then flushed with rage. "I work for Lifeguard," she said quietly. "I've been processing claims like this for 3 years. I know exactly what policy loophole they're exploiting." She pulled out her phone, dialed a number from memory. "This is Emily Miller, Agent ID 47582. I need to speak with Claims Supervisor Davidson immediately." The conversation that followed was brief and brutal. Emily's voice remained professionally calm, but Sarah could hear the fury beneath it. When Emily hung up, she looked like she might be sick. "They won't budge," Emily said. "Company policy. They said I should understand, given my position." "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked. Emily's response was immediate. "I'm quitting. Effective immediately. I'm not working for a company that would do this to my father." "Emily, no. You have a career, a life in Seattle. None of that matters. Not anymore." Sarah showed Emily the home equity loan documents then, explained what she'd done. Emily listened, her face growing more stricken with each word. "So even with that, we're still short $300,000. Emily said. "Yes." They sat in silence, doing math that wouldn't work, no matter how they calculated it. Emily's Seattle condo might sell for $95,000 if they were lucky. Sarah and Thomas had $47,000 in retirement savings. Everything they owned, everything they'd built over 30 years, wouldn't cover half of what they owed. "The bank called," Sarah admitted. "They want the first payment on the home equity loan in 30 days. If we can't pay, they'll foreclose." Emily looked at her mother, really looked at her. Sarah had aged 10 years in 3 days. Her hair, usually neatly styled, hung limp around her face. Her clothes were the same ones she'd thrown on Sunday morning, now wrinkled and stained with coffee and tears. "Mom, when did you last eat?" Sarah couldn't remember. They went to the hospital cafeteria, forced down sandwiches that tasted like cardboard. Around them, other families dealt with their own crises, their own impossible situations. Healthcare in America, Sarah thought bitterly, the richest country in the world, where a man could die or go bankrupt, but rarely escape both. On the fourth day, Thomas began to wake. The doctors reduced his sedation gradually, bringing him back to consciousness in stages. Sarah and Emily were there when his left eye finally opened, the only part of his face not covered in bandages. He couldn't speak with the breathing tube in place, but his eye found Sarah's face, then Emily's. Confusion, then recognition, then something that looked like joy flashed across that one visible eye. Tears leaked from the corner, running down into the bandages. Emily took his hand. "Hi, Daddy. I'm here. I came home." His fingers squeezed hers weakly. Over the next 2 days, they removed the breathing tube. Thomas's first words were barely audible, his voice destroyed by days of intubation. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Sarah leaned close. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Emily, your wedding, I know. Daddy, I know about the accident. I read your letter." Thomas's eye widened. He looked at Sarah, questioning. "I gave it to her," Sarah said. "She needed to know the truth." Fresh tears came then, from all three of them. Emily laid her head on her father's shoulder, careful not to disturb the bandages, and cried for 5 years of misunderstanding. On the 6th day, they allowed Thomas to see himself. A nurse brought a small hand mirror, warned him it would be shocking. Thomas insisted anyway. The bandages had been reduced to cover just the surgical site. His face was revealed in stages. The massive swelling had gone down, but what remained was worse. The right side of his face sagged, muscle and structure missing. A livid corridor ran from his ear to his chin. His cheek was concave where it should have been full. Thomas stared at his reflection for a long moment. Then he closed his eye and turned away. "I'm a monster," he said. Sarah took the mirror away, set it aside. She cupped his face in her hands, gentle around the damaged areas. "You're my husband. You're Emily's father. You're the man I've loved for 30 years. That hasn't changed. Look at me. I am looking at you. I see you. Thomas, I've always seen you." But Thomas couldn't meet her eyes. The man who'd built his identity on physical strength, on providing and protecting, now felt like a burden, like something broken that couldn't be fixed. That night, after Sarah and Emily had gone home to shower and change, Thomas lay alone in his hospital room. A full-length mirror stood in the corner. He couldn't stop looking at it, couldn't stop seeing the stranger who looked back. Everything he'd sacrificed, everything he'd worked for, and for what he'd destroyed his family's financial future. He'd spent 5 years estranged from his daughter over pride and misguided protection. He'd almost died because he was too stubborn to admit weakness. The monitor beside his bed beeped steadily, each tone marking another heartbeat he didn't deserve. 2 weeks after surgery, Thomas was learning to live in a body that no longer felt like his own. Physical therapy helped him regain the ability to eat solid foods, though chewing remained difficult with diminished muscle function. Speech therapy taught him to compensate for the facial paralysis, to form words despite half his mouth refusing to cooperate properly. Every morning, a nurse helped him to the bathroom. Every morning, he avoided looking in the mirror. Every morning, he failed. The stranger looking back wore his eyes, his graying hair, but the asymmetry of the face made Thomas's stomach turn. He'd spent his whole life believing that a man's worth was tied to his strength, his ability to provide and protect. Now he couldn't even recognize himself. Sarah came every day, sitting beside his bed for hours, reading to him or simply holding his hand. Emily had moved back to Pittsburgh temporarily, staying in her old bedroom, and visited every evening after job hunting. Neither woman mentioned the mounting bills, the financial catastrophe bearing down on them like a freight train. Thomas thought about his father constantly during those long hospital days. The old man had died when Thomas was 25, succumbed to cancer that started as a mole he'd ignored for too long. Like father, like son, Thomas thought bitterly. They'd both been too proud, too stubborn, too convinced that real men didn't need help. He wondered what advice his father would give him now. Probably the same advice that had gotten them both into this mess. Tough it out. Don't complain. Be strong. Thomas was beginning to understand that his father had been wrong. On the 15th day, Dr. Patricia Hayes came to visit. During her rounds, she pulled up a chair beside his bed, an unusual gesture. Doctors didn't typically sit with their patients. "How are you feeling, Thomas?" she asked. "Like I've been put through a wood chipper." She smiled slightly. "That's not far from the medical reality of what happened. I wanted to talk to you about something that's been on my mind." Thomas waited. "Do you remember me?" Dr. Hayes asked. "From before. Before all this." He studied her face. The kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the hint of gray in her dark hair. Something nagged at his memory. "You seem familiar, but I can't place it. Lawrenceville High School, class of 1990. The pieces started clicking together. Patricia Hayes, Patricia with the thick glasses and the tendency to trip over her own feet. Patricia, who he and his friends had tormented, though Thomas tried now not to remember the specific cruelties of teenage boys. "Oh, God," he said. "I'm sorry. I was such a jerk back then." "You were," she agreed. "You made my life pretty miserable for about 2 years." Thomas wanted to sink into the hospital bed and disappear. Of all the surgeons in Pittsburgh, his life had been saved by someone he'd bullied. "But I want you to know something," Dr. Hayes continued. "Do you remember June 15th, 1988? Thomas searched his memory. "Nothing came. I didn't think you would. It was just another summer day for you, but for my family, it was the day our lives changed." She pulled out her phone, showed him a photo of a man in a white coat, a stethoscope around his neck. "This is my brother, Danny. He's a pediatrician now in Philadelphia. Saves kids' lives every single day." "I don't understand," Thomas said. 37 years ago, Danny nearly drowned at Morrison Lake. Someone pulled him out, performed CPR, brought him back. By the time our parents arrived, the person who saved him was gone. We never learned who it was for years. I wanted to find him and say thank you. Danny has spent his entire career saving children because someone once saved him. Thomas felt something stirring in his memory. Morrison Lake. He'd been 17, walking home after baseball practice, He'd heard screaming, seen a kid go under. The water had been cold, the current strong, but Thomas was a good swimmer. He'd pulled the boy out, made sure he was breathing, then left before anyone could make a fuss about it. He'd never thought about it again. It was just what you did when someone needed help. "The lifeguard scar on your right shoulder," Dr. Hayes said quietly. "I noticed it during surgery. My brother told me his rescuer had that same scar. I did some checking. You were a lifeguard that summer." Thomas couldn't speak. "You saved my brother's life, Thomas. And 37 years later, I got to save yours. I don't believe in fate, Pierre, but I believe in debts paid forward. We're even now." After Dr. Hayes left, Thomas lay alone with this new understanding. He'd forgotten about saving that boy, had done it without thinking because it was simply the right thing to do. And somehow, across decades, that single act had come back to save his own life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd saved a drowning child without hesitation, but had nearly killed himself through pride and stubbornness. That afternoon, 3 men appeared in his doorway. Jake, Marcus, and Dennis from the workshop, looking uncomfortable in their clean work clothes, holding baseball caps in their rough hands. "Boss," Jake said, "you look like hell." Despite everything, Thomas laughed. It hurt his face, but he laughed. They came in, pulled up chairs, filled the room with the comfortable silence of men who work together. After a few minutes, Marcus cleared his throat. "We did something," he said. "Hope you're not mad." Dennis pulled out his phone, showed Thomas a GoFundMe page. The photo was of their workshop, the sign reading Miller Carpentry visible in the background. The title read, "Help Save Thomas Miller." Thomas scrolled through the page, seeing messages from people he'd worked with over the years, customers, neighbors, people whose names he barely recognized. The total at the top made his breath catch: $89,342 from 1,247 donors. "I don't understand," Thomas whispered. "Remember when I wrecked my truck?" Jake said. "Year after my divorce. You lent me $5,000. Told me to pay it back when I could. I never did, and you never asked." Marcus spoke next. "My son's college tuition, you paid the whole first semester. Said it was a bonus, but I knew we hadn't had that good a year. Tommy graduated last spring because you gave him a chance." Dennis looked down at his hands. "Nobody wanted to hire me when I got out. I had a record. Couldn't get a straight answer from anyone. You gave me a job, no questions asked. Gave me a life back." Thomas had forgotten about all of these things. They were just what you did for people who needed help. "There's more," Jake said. "We talked to Reverend Patterson at Christ Community Church. They're holding a fundraiser next month, and your old high school is organizing a charity gala." "Why would they do that?" Thomas asked. Bewildered. "Because you matter to people, boss. You spent 30 years helping folks and never asked for anything back. Now it's our turn." After they left, Thomas thought about the kind of man he'd been. He'd helped people quietly, without fanfare, because it seemed right. But he'd never accepted help himself. He'd viewed asking for assistance as weakness, as failure. He'd been wrong about so much. That evening, Sarah brought him a notebook and pen. Thomas's right hand still worked, though writing was harder with the facial pain. He began composing a new letter to Emily. This one would be different. No secrets, no hidden truths, meant to protect her. Just honesty about his fears, his failures, his love for her. He wrote about the wedding, about why he'd hidden the accident. He wrote about his pride, his stubborn belief that fathers should be strong and silent. He wrote about learning that strength comes in many forms. And sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is admit he needs help. "What are you writing?" Sarah asked. "The truth," Thomas said. Finally, that night, for the first time since the surgery, Thomas looked at his reflection and held his own gaze. The scarred stranger looking back was him. Would always be him now. But maybe that was okay. Maybe this face, damaged and imperfect, was more honest than the one he'd worn before. Maybe this was what healing actually looked like. 6 months later, Thomas Miller stood in his workshop on an October afternoon, autumn light streaming through the windows he'd installed 20 years ago. His face bore the permanent marks of his ordeal, the right side sagging where muscle used to be, a thick scar running from ear to chin. He no longer hid it. The beard was gone, shaved away to prevent any future infections. This was his face now, a map of survival. The radiation therapy had ended 3 weeks ago. His oncologist had used the word remission at the last appointment. Though she'd cautioned that basal cell carcinoma could recur, Thomas would need quarterly checkups for the rest of his life, constant vigilance against the enemy that had nearly killed him. He was alive. That was what mattered. The final GoFundMe tally had reached $127,856 from over 2,000 donors. People Thomas had worked with, neighbors he'd barely spoken to, customers from jobs completed years ago. Each donation came with a message. "You built our deck. You fixed my porch for free when I lost my job. You gave my son a chance." Thomas had read every single message, had wept over some of them. He'd spent 30 years helping people without keeping score, and now they'd saved his family from financial ruin. Christ. Community Church had organized a pancake breakfast fundraiser that raised $45,000. His old high school held a charity gala. Former classmates he hadn't seen in decades contributing another $38,000. Dr. Patricia Hayes had quietly donated $10,000 under an anonymous name, though Thomas recognized the amount because it was exactly what Danny's medical school debt had been. Emily had sold her Seattle condo for $95,000, moved back to Pittsburgh permanently. Combined with their retirement savings and the community contributions, they'd raised $305,856. The hospital had accepted a payment plan for the remaining balance. They'd be paying it off for years, but they'd kept their house, the home Thomas had built with his own hands, where he'd raised his daughter, where he'd loved his wife for 3 decades, remained theirs. They even had $18,000 left over. Thomas wanted to donate it to a fund for uninsured patients. Sarah had agreed immediately. A new sign hung outside the workshop: Miller and Daughter Carpentry. Emily worked beside him now, learning the trade she'd shown no interest in as a teenager. She couldn't swing a hammer as well as Jake or operate the table saw with Marcus's precision, but she had an eye for design that surprised all of them. Their first project together was a commission from UPMC's Cancer Center, custom furniture for their waiting room, pieces that would comfort frightened patients and exhausted families. Thomas and Emily worked side by side, measuring and cutting, sanding and staining, Emily's hands had never held tools before, but they learned quickly. She'd found work at a nonprofit organization advocating for health care reform. The pay was a fraction of what she'd earned at lifeguard insurance. But she came home energized, purposeful. She was fighting to ensure that other families wouldn't face the impossible choices hers had confronted. Jake, Marcus, and Dennis had kept the business running during Thomas's hospitalization and recovery. They'd refused to accept full pay for those months, insisting on splitting Thomas's share among themselves. When he'd protested, Marcus had simply said, "Family takes care of family." That's what they were now. Not just co-workers, but family. Sunday dinners became sacred every week. Sarah cooked Thomas's favorite chicken soup, the recipe passed down from her grandmother. Emily brought her boyfriend Brian, a quiet man who taught high school history and looked at Emily like she'd hung the moon. Thomas liked him, though he'd initially struggled with the instinct to interrogate any man who came near his daughter. Sarah had gently reminded him that Emily was 28, perfectly capable of choosing her own partner. Thomas was learning to let go, to trust, to not try to control everything. It wasn't easy. Old habits died hard. He still caught himself being stubborn, still had to consciously choose vulnerability over pride, but he was trying, and that was enough. The best news came in September. Emily was pregnant. She told them over Sunday dinner. Brian's hand trembling as he held hers. Sarah had cried happy tears. Thomas had stood, walked around the table, and pulled his daughter into a careful hug. "I'm going to be a grandfather," he'd whispered against her hair. "You're going to be amazing at it," Emily had whispered back. They decided to name the baby Robert Thomas. If it was a boy, Robert, after Thomas's best friend who died of skin cancer 3 years ago. The friend who'd kept the secret about the wedding accident, who'd worked beside Thomas for 25 years, whose funeral Thomas had attended in stoic silence because men didn't cry. Thomas had visited Robert's grave last week, stood before the headstone, and finally said the words he'd never spoken while his friend was alive. "I miss you. Thank you for being my brother. I'm sorry I never told you that." He'd cried then, standing in the cemetery, and it had felt like healing. Now, in the workshop, Thomas guided Emily's hands as she used the router to shape the arm of a rocking chair. They were building it for the baby, a piece that would last generations. Thomas's grandfather had built furniture. His father had built furniture. Now he was teaching his daughter. And someday, perhaps, she'd teach his grandchild. Legacy wasn't about hiding weakness or projecting strength. It was about connection, honesty. Love passed forward through generations. Sarah appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with lemonade and cookies. She smiled, watching them work together, and Thomas saw the same woman he'd married 30 years ago. The years had added lines to her face, silver to her hair. But she was beautiful. She'd always been beautiful. "I love you," he said, the words coming easier now. Sarah's smile widened. "I love you too." On the wall hung his father's old shaving mirror, the one Thomas had used that Monday morning when this all began. Beside it, he'd placed 2 photographs. The first showed his face before symmetrical, unremarkable, hiding secrets beneath carefully maintained stubble. The second showed him now scarred, asymmetrical, honest. He preferred the second. The radio played softly in the background, Louis Armstrong's gravelly voice singing, What a wonderful world, Thomas hummed along, his voice rough from the surgery, but happy. Emily joined in, her clear soprano harmonizing with his broken melody. Outside, the autumn sun painted Pittsburgh in shades of gold and amber. Inside the workshop built by his own hands, surrounded by a family chosen and born, Thomas Miller finally understood what it meant to be strong. It meant asking for help. It meant accepting love. It meant living with scars visible to the world and finding beauty in imperfection. It meant being human. Thomas Miller's story isn't just about a bump that became a nightmare. It's about something many of us carry, the belief that asking for help makes us weak. For too long, we've been told that strength means suffering in silence, that real toughness is ignoring pain until it goes away. But Thomas learned what too many discovered too late: that kind of strength can kill you. How many of us have ignored that persistent ache, that unusual mark on our skin, that nagging symptom we tell ourselves is nothing? How many relationships have we let fade because pride kept us from saying, "I was wrong," or "I need you"? Thomas almost lost everything: his life, his family, his home, because he believed the lie that men don't cry and fathers don't need help. But here's the beautiful truth his story reveals. Real strength is vulnerability. Real courage is admitting you're scared. Real love is letting people see your scars and trusting they'll stay anyway. Thomas got his second chance, but not everyone does. Don't wait for a crisis to tell the people you love that you love them. Don't let pride steal years you can't get back. Your health is your family's wealth, and your presence is the greatest gift you can give. What's one thing you've been putting off that you know you should address? Has pride ever cost you something precious? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.